Imagine, if you will, a temple so vast it seemed to have been carved by the hands of giants rather than mortal men. A sanctuary of marble and gold rising from the Ionian coast, where the veil between the human and the divine felt whisper thin. This was the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, a wonder of the ancient world that history itself seemed to have swallowed whole. We are drawn to what endures, to monuments that still cast shadows across the centuries. But what of a wonder that was erased so completely? Its ruins today are a quiet marshland, a single reconstructed column pointing toward an empty sky like a sundial robbed of its sun. You stand there and feel an immense absence, a hollow in the fabric of history, where one of humanity's greatest achievements should still stand. The silence is not peaceful. It is the unnerving quiet of a story that has been violently interrupted, a song cut off mid-verse. How does a structure that burned so brightly in the imagination of the ancient world simply dissolve into reeds and standing water? We are told that time buries all things, but the Temple of Artemis did not merely fade. It was systematically unmade. To trace its ghost, we must travel back to a world that believed gods walked the earth, and that a sanctuary could be built as a foothold for the divine. The Ionian Greeks of Ephesus, around the 6th century before Christ, decided to raise a temple so magnificent that it would honor a goddess who was far older than even their own myths. Artemis of Ephesus was not the slender huntress of Greek tradition, but a maternal, ancient mother goddess, her torso covered with what may be eggs, breasts, or the testicles of sacrificed bulls. She was a figure of unsettling abundance, her cult rooted in Anatolian darkness, and her temple would need to be a house worthy of her terrifying fertility. The architects, Chersiphron and his son Metagenes, confronted a logistical nightmare: how to lift colossal stone architraves into place on marshy ground that trembled with earthquakes. They devised an engineering secret that still provokes a quiet awe. They laid the foundations on a bed of compressed charcoal and fleece to absorb the eternal tremors of the earth. For over a century, the temple rose, funded by the tribute of kings, until it stood as the largest marble building the Greek world had ever witnessed. Its dimensions were staggering, over 115 meters long and 55 meters wide, a forest of more than 100 Ionic columns, each towering 18 meters into the Mediterranean light. Each column was a gift from a king, and at the base of several were sculpted colossal drums carved with scenes of gods and heroes in combat. The roof was sheathed in pure marble tiles, and the inner sanctuary housed the archaic wooden statue of the many-breasted goddess, draped in ritual garments and buzzing with the prayers of the faithful. Pilgrims came not just from Greece and Persia, but from the farthest edges of the known world, seeking refuge, healing, and the magic of a sanctuary that was also a bank and a city of asylum. You must see it not as a silent ruin, but as a clattering, incense-filled nexus of human desperation and hope, a place so sacred that even invading armies left their weapons at its gates. For decades, this wonder stood inviolate, a testament to the idea that some things were simply too beautiful, too holy, to be destroyed by human hands. But the silence of history is often broken by a singular, terrible noise: the crackling of an arsonist's torch. On the night of July 21st, 356 BC, a man named Herostratus set fire to the temple, a crime so audacious it still echoes as a warning about the darkness of the human ego. Herostratus was not a general or a conqueror. He was a non-entity who admitted under torture that he did it solely to make his name immortal. The Ephesian authorities, in a desperate attempt to thwart his posthumous fame, executed him and decreed that his name never be spoken or recorded under pain of death. Yet here we are, more than 2 millennia later, whispering his name into the digital void, a chilling irony that proves his deranged thesis was fundamentally correct. The wooden roof, the grain stores, the sacred furnishings, all turned to ash. The marble columns calcined and shattered, collapsing inward like the ribs of a dying beast. Legend holds that on that very night, Alexander the Great was born in distant Macedonia. A cosmic symmetry the historian Plutarch noted. The goddess was too busy attending the birth of a conqueror to save her own burning house. When the morning sun rose over Ephesus, the smoke drifted over a landscape of charred marble and broken offerings, the wonder of the world reduced to a smoldering crime scene. But the story of the Temple of Artemis refuses to end in a single night of flame, because the human impulse to rebuild is almost as strong as the impulse to destroy. The Ephesians, with a collective resilience that borders on the miraculous, began to gather the fallen columns and scrape away the soot almost immediately. They hired the most visionary architect of the age, Dinocrates, who would later go on to plan the city of Alexandria, and tasked him with raising the temple anew on the same sacred, shaken ground. The new temple was built on an even higher platform, a massive 13-step crepidoma that lifted the sanctuary further from the marsh and closer to the sky. Alexander the Great himself, seeing the rebuilt wonder, offered to finance the entire project on the sole condition that his name be carved into the dedication, an offer the Ephesians diplomatically refused. With a tactful genius, they replied that it was not fitting for one god to build a temple for another god, thus preserving their civic pride while narrowly avoiding imperial offense. This second temple was grander than the first, filled with paintings by Apelles, statues by Praxiteles, and a treasure house so vast it rivaled the treasuries of kings. It became the Louvre of the ancient world, a place where art, religion, and commerce intermingled under the shadow of a goddess who stared impassively into eternity. For another 600 years, the temple stood, surviving the rise and fall of empires, the shifting sands of pagan belief, and the slow erosion that gnaws at all things man-made. But the second death of the temple was not a single cataclysm. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling, a quiet erasure that history books often gloss over like a deathbed confession. When the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, the old gods did not simply vanish. Their houses were systematically disassembled, repurposed, and forgotten. The marble columns of the Temple of Artemis were toppled by the decree of Emperor Theodosius, their smooth, fluted surfaces carted away to build churches, baths, and fortifications in far-off Constantinople. Archaeologists would later find the green-streaked marble drums of Artemis wedged into the foundations of the great church of Hagia Sophia, a final indignity for a goddess who once ruled the minds of millions. What the Christians did not take, the Goths had already sacked, and what the Goths left, the slow, patient creep of the Cayster River's silt buried under meters of mud and forgetfulness. By the Middle Ages, the very location of the temple had become a matter of local myth, the geography of faith erased by the geography of a changing landscape. You might wonder how an entire village could lose a building the size of a football stadium. But the earth here reclaims its own with a voracious, silent hunger. For centuries, travelers would visit Ephesus and ask the farmers where the great wonder stood, only to be met with blank stares and gestures toward empty, malaria-infested marshes. This is the true labyrinth of the mystery, not just the physical destruction, but the systematic erasure of a site so sacred that it had once defined the identity of an entire civilization. It wasn't until the 19th century that a dedicated English archaeologist, John Turtle Wood, became obsessed with the maddening riddle of where the temple lay buried. For 6 long, grueling years, he dug blind. He unearthed grand theaters and marble streets, but the temple remained a ghost, taunting him from just beyond the edge of his spade. The ancient geographer Strabo had left a crucial clue, that the temple stood just outside the city walls. But the walls themselves were buried, and the river had since shifted its course by miles. Wood's health deteriorated in the malarial swamps. His workers died, his funds dried up, and the mocking silence of the waterlogged soil became a personal obsession, a battle of one man against the void of history. Then, in the final days of 1869, while sinking a deep test pit in a marshy field locals used for grazing sheep, his crew struck something solid. They carefully dug through the black, fibrous silt that the charcoal and fleece foundation had created, until they uncovered the pristine base of a marble column, still lying exactly where it had fallen in the 4th century AD. It was not just a column base. It was the exact spot where the wonder had made its final stand against gravity, and Wood knew he had done the impossible. Yet, even in triumph, the excavation revealed a disquieting truth. The temple was not just buried, it was almost entirely gone, stripped by centuries of stone robbers. They found fragments, a single sculpted column drum depicting the god Thanatos, a few silver coins, the broken fingers of marble goddesses, but the towering majesty was reduced to a scatter of bones in a watery grave. The so-called wonder had become a negative space, a puzzle that defined itself by absence rather than presence, and that absence was far more haunting than any standing ruin. Wood shipped what he could to the British Museum, a room of disembodied heads and lone column drums that now stare out at visitors with a kind of mute, tragic exile. And here, in the labyrinth of theories, we must ask a darker question. Was the temple's erasure not just the work of time, but a deliberate closing of a spiritual door? Some researchers suggest that the cult of the Ephesian Artemis was so deeply rooted in the region that early Christian authorities viewed its utter obliteration as a cosmic necessity. They did not want a ruin that could become a pilgrimage site for stubborn pagans. They needed a void, a blank slate where no magic could possibly linger. The demolition was so thorough that even today, we cannot be completely certain of the exact architectural arrangement of the upper colonnades. Every surviving coin from the Roman era that depicts the temple shows something slightly different, as if the artists themselves were memorializing a fevered dream that logic could not capture. We are left with an image of a temple that was impossible to build, dedicated to a goddess, impossible to understand, and destroyed with a thoroughness that feels almost supernatural. The boundaries of fact and theory blur in the reed beds of Ephesus, and the deeper you dig into the records, the more you feel yourself slipping into a chasm of forgotten purpose. And what of the human element? What of the minds that have been swallowed by this silence? Consider Herostratus again, that lonely arsonist who understood a terrifying truth. Destruction is the most efficient form of immortality if the thing destroyed was loved enough. The Ephesian priests, in their eternal wisdom, tried to curse his memory, but the curse backfired, making his name a philosophical riddle that seduces every historian who hears it. Then, there are the archaeologists like Wood, who gave their health and sanity to the swamp, only to find that the real treasure was not gold, but the haunting confirmation that the miracle was truly dead. There is a particular psychological weight that falls on a scholar who realizes they have dedicated their life to exhuming an absence, to proving that a void exists where a world-shaking monument once stood. You can see it in their journals. The initial thrill of discovery curdling into a quiet, existential melancholy as they piece together the scale of the destruction. The fragments they unearthed were not beautiful in the way a Greek statue is beautiful. They were charred, mutilated, and water-stained, testifying to a violence that no amount of museum curation can fully sanitize. Local whispers, the muted folklore of the Turkish villagers who lived near the site, long held that the ground itself was cursed and that digging there brought sickness and bad fortune. Science calls it malaria from the stagnant water, but the human psyche calls it the residual wrath of a goddess who does not wish to be remembered as a victim of her own fall. Deep inside every one of us lies a fear that our greatest creations are ultimately fragile, that the universe is indifferent to our marble and our prayers. The Temple of Artemis becomes a mirror for that fear, a cautionary tale about the hubris of believing that stone can hold back the tide of forgetting. Its disappearance is not a historical footnote. It is a slow-motion catastrophe that continues even now, as the remaining fragments are eroded by acid rain and the encroach of modern development. The gentle lapping of water in the stagnant ponds where the altar once stood is not a sound of peace. It is the sound of history dissolving one mineral molecule at a time. We seek closure in these stories, a neat moral about the sacrilege of Herostratus or the triumph of Christianity, but the swamp refuses to offer us any such comfort. It holds its secrets beneath a glassy surface of green algae, clutching the last unmapped stones in a fist of mud older than the city of Rome itself. As we drift toward the final fading of this mystery, we must confront the enduring enigma. What exactly was lost? That sensation of standing before a forest of luminous marble columns, of hearing the chants of eunuch priests echoing through a sanctuary lit by oil lamps, is a sensation dead to the universe. The loss of the physical temple is tragic, but the loss of that collective human emotion, that gasp of wonder, is an extinction event for a piece of the soul. You look at the single reconstructed column on the site, assembled from mismatched fragments by modern conservators, and it does not resurrect the past. It acts as a tombstone. It says more about our desperate need to see something than it does about the glory of Artemis. The marsh grass rustles in the evening wind, and the shadows of migrating birds cross the muddy water. And for a fleeting second, you might imagine the ghost of a flight of stairs. But the image dissolves because the Temple of Artemis belongs to a category of lost things that are far more gone than simply ruined. It is a thing that has been erased from the world and from the eyes of all who might have remembered it. Even the stars which witnessed its construction and its two violent deaths seem to hold their light a little dimmer over that patch of Anatolian coast, as if paying homage to a vigil that will never end. We tell ourselves that knowledge is power, that archaeology can resurrect the dead. But standing on that silent ground teaches you a humbling lesson. Some vaults of human experience are permanently sealed, their keys melted in the fires of Herostratus and ground to dust by the march of zealots. The final whisper of the Temple of Artemis is not a revelation of its secrets, but a question addressed directly to you, the curious listener, probing the darkness of the past. If a monument of such immensity can vanish from the earth almost without a trace, what else have we lost that we are not even wise enough to mourn? And what does that say about the permanence of the monuments we erect in our own age, beneath the same silent witness-bearing stars?